There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to places like this. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street late at night. Something older and heavier than that. The silence of a place that was once full of noise and life and human ambition, and has since been emptied out completely, not by any single event, but by the slow, patient accumulation of time. The silence of a place that remembers being something and has spent a very long time becoming nothing. That is the silence that greets you when you push through the tree line and step into what remains of this town. And it stops you every single time. We are in the mountains of Washington State today, somewhere in the Western Cascades, and we are standing in what was once a genuine, functioning, populated gold mining town. At its peak, and the peak came fast, came the way it always did in these places, a sudden rush of people and capital and noise that collapsed just as quickly as it arrived. This town had somewhere between 300 and 400 residents. It had a hotel, it had a general store, a post office, a school, at least 2 saloons by most accounts, a handful of boarding houses, a small hospital or medical station, and a whole network of subsidiary businesses and services that spring up wherever a significant number of people decide to make a go of it in a remote location. There was a mill. There were stamp mills for processing the ore. There was a concentrator. There were dozens of small cabins and bunkhouses scattered across the benches above and below the main street. This was not a camp. This was a town. And now it is a forest. The date this place was founded, best as we can establish from the historical record, was 1897. The first significant gold strike in the drainage had come a year or two earlier, attracting the initial wave of prospectors and the forward-looking investors who always followed close behind. By 1897, there was enough activity, enough capital, enough confidence in the district to justify building permanent structures. The hotel went up, the mill was constructed, the post office was established, which in practical terms meant the federal government had officially recognized this place as a community worth serving. People arrived with their families, children attended school, someone planted a garden, someone else built a proper front porch on their cabin and sat on it in the evenings, watching the light fade on the peaks above. For a few years, this was a real place where real people lived real lives. By 1907, it was essentially over. 10 years, that is all this town got. A decade from founding to abandonment, which is actually a fairly typical arc for a remote single-industry mountain community of this period. The vein that drove everything played out, or became too expensive to work profitably, or the gold price shifted, or some combination of all
Looks
three.
like they're stuck for good.
The mill shut down. The miners drifted away to the next district, the next promising drainage, the next assay report that suggested another fortune waiting in another mountain. The families packed what they could carry and made the long journey back to wherever they had come from. The hotel closed, the post office was decommissioned, and the forest, which had been held back by the clearing and the constant activity and the smoke from dozens of stoves, began its slow and steady advance. 100 and some years later, it has done its work thoroughly. What the forest does to a wooden structure over the course of a century in the Pacific Northwest is almost alchemical in its completeness. It starts with the roof. The cedar shingles that covered every building out here were excellent for their time. Dense, tight-grained, naturally resistant to rot, but they were not immortal. Within a decade of abandonment, the first shingles begin to fail. Water gets in, the rafters soften, the ridge beam sags. Eventually, the roof collapses inward, and once the roof is gone, the walls follow quickly. The sill plates rot from below, undermined by soil moisture and the relentless pressure of roots. On the wall, studs lean and then fall. The whole structure, which once stood proud and plumb and square, subsides into the ground in a process that looks like the earth simply reaching up and pulling it down. And then the moss comes, and the ferns, and the salal, and the Oregon grape and the vine maple, and eventually, given enough time, the trees themselves. Hemlock and cedar seedlings taking root in the rotting wood of collapsed walls, growing up through what was once a floor, their roots spreading through the old foundations, their canopies eventually rising high enough to shade the ground below and complete the transformation of the built environment back into the natural one. It is something to witness. The approach to this site is through second-growth forest. The timber out here was logged sometime in the mid-20th century. It's probably the 1950s or 1960s, judging by the size of the current stand, and it gives no indication of what you're walking toward. No interpretive signs, no maintained trail, not even the subtle changes in vegetation that sometimes signal an old clearing. Just forest, dense and monotonous. The ground covered in sword ferns and oxalis, the canopy 40 or 50 feet overhead. And then you crest a small rise in the terrain, and the first ruins come into view, and everything changes. The first structure
we hit a
you
good
see
vein
is
down by
what
the
we
creek.
believe was
That's
one
so.
of the boarding
We'll
houses.
need more timber by
The
Tuesday.
footprint is substantial, maybe 40 by 60 feet, larger than any single-family residence, but not large enough for the hotel. And the collapse pattern suggests a two-story building. The remains are dramatic. The sill plates are still partially in place, white outlining the footprint of the building with remarkable clarity given their age. Inside that outline, collapsed inward and now sitting at various angles and stages of decomposition, are the remnants of the wall framing and the floor system. Massive hewn timbers that once formed the main structural members of the building lie in a jumbled pile, wrapped in moss so thick and so uniform that each timber looks like it's been upholstered in green velvet. Ferns have colonized every horizontal surface. 2 hemlock trees, each probably 60 or 70 years old, grow up through the center of the collapse, their roots threading through the fallen framing in a way that makes it impossible to imagine removing the trees without removing what remains of the structure. We spend time here. There is always something to find in a collapse like this if you look carefully and patiently. On the north side of the footprint, partially buried under decades of accumulated organic matter, leaf litter, bark, the fine black humus that Pacific Northwest forest produces in abundance. There is ironwork, hinges mostly. Large strap hinges of the kind used on heavy doors, hand-forged, the iron now reduced to a deep porous rust, but still completely recognizable in form. A few square-cut nails. What appears to be a door-latch mechanism, the spring long since seized, but the overall form intact. These small pieces of ironwork are often the most durable artifacts on a site like this because the surrounding organic material, acidic as it is, actually forms a kind of protective coating over the iron as it oxidizes. The rust goes deep, but it goes slowly, and pieces like these can survive a century or more in the forest floor. Moving further into the site, the ruins become denser. This is where the core of the town was concentrated, on a bench that was artificially widened and leveled at some point. You can see the cut and fill of the original grading work in the way the terrain steps down at the back of the bench, a straight line that no natural hillside would produce. Along this bench, at roughly equal intervals suggesting some kind of deliberate lot system, the footprints of 5 or 6 additional structures are visible, smaller than the boarding house, probably individual cabins or small commercial buildings. The collapses here are more complete, less standing material, are more completely integrated into the forest floor, which suggests these were lighter construction buildings that succumbed to the forest more quickly than the heavier-built boarding house. Between the structural remnants, the ground is scattered with the artifacts of daily life. This is the part that never gets old, no matter how many of these sites you visit. The everyday objects, the things that were too heavy or too broken or too numerous to bother carrying out when the town was abandoned. A fragment of a cast iron stove, the characteristic ribbed side panel still recognizable, even though it has separated from the rest of the unit and is now half buried in the forest floor. A cluster of blue and green glass fragments that were once bottles, medicine bottles, whiskey bottles, and the small square bottles that held the patent medicines that were the primary pharmaceutical option for most people in 1900. A ceramic shard with a blue transfer print pattern on it, the kind of cheap decorated pottery that was mass-produced in England and exported to North America by the shipload in the late 19th century. You find this stuff everywhere, on every site of this period, anywhere in North America where people were living. And it never stops being remarkable. Someone ate off this plate. This was their everyday dish, the one they used for every meal, carried carefully out here into the mountains and used until it broke and was discarded. And it has been lying in this forest for over 100 years. There is a path, not a maintained trail, just a faint line of slightly compressed vegetation that suggests this route is used occasionally by the small number of people who know this place exists, that leads from the main cabin area down toward the creek. We follow it, and it takes us to what we came here specifically to see, the mill, or what is left of it. The mill complex sat at the lower end of the bench, close to the creek where water power was available and where the noise and the dust of ore processing could be kept somewhat separate from the residential areas above. What remains today is more substantial than anything we've seen so far on this site, because mill structures were built to different specifications than residential buildings, heavier, more industrial. The foundations were often poured concrete or carefully laid dry stone masonry rather than the simple wood sill-on-ground construction used for cabins, and those foundations, unlike the wooden structures they once supported, do not rot. The concrete foundation pads are still here, several of them, each one representing the base of a piece of heavy processing equipment, a stamped mill battery perhaps, or an ore bin, or a concentrating table. They are cracked and heaved by decades of freeze-thaw cycles, partially buried by the accumulation of forest debris, but fundamentally intact. You can still read the bolt patterns in the concrete where the equipment was anchored, still see the grooves and channels that were cast in to manage the flow of water and slurry through the processing circuit. This is industrial archaeology in its purest form. The negative space where the machines once were, the ghost of their footprint preserved in stone. To understand what a stamp mill actually did and why it was so central to an operation like this, you need to understand the basic problem of hard rock gold mining. The gold in a quartz vein is not loose and free the way placer gold is in a stream. It is locked inside the rock, often at a microscopic scale, distributed through the quartz and the sulfide minerals in particles too small to see with the naked eye. To get at it, you have to crush the rock first, reduce it to a fine powder. The stamp mill was the primary crushing technology of the late 19th century. Heavy iron stamps lifted and dropped repeatedly onto the ore in a rhythmic pounding that could be heard for miles in these mountain drainages and that ran 24 hours a day when the operation was active. The noise was extraordinary. The vibration was constant. And the gold-bearing slurry that came out the other end went on to concentrating tables and amalgamation plates where the actual gold recovery happened. It was loud and dirty and dangerous and relentlessly mechanical, and it was the economic heart of every hard rock gold operation of this era. And then, half buried in the bank on the uphill side of the mill side, we find the thing that makes this living. It is a section of wooden penstock pipe, not the steel-banded stave pipe that you see on some sites. This is different. This is an early pressure pipe made from solid board timber, a technology that predates the stave pipe and was already being phased out by the late 1890s in favor of more modern construction. The pipe is about 18 inches in diameter, bored from a single log. You can see the bore marks on the interior surface where the bit cut through the wood, and reinforced with iron bands at roughly 12-inch intervals. Most of the pipe has long since rotted away, but this section, protected by the bank it's partially buried in, has survived. and it is remarkable, not just as an artifact, but as a piece of technology. Someone bored this pipe by hand from a single log, fitted the iron bands, and used it to carry water under pressure to drive the mill equipment. The engineering intelligence represented in that simple object is real and significant, and worth pausing to appreciate. We follow the line of the penstock uphill, back through the forest, looking for the intake structure where it's connected to the creek. We don't find it. Too much time and too much forest growth has intervened, but we do find something along the way that we weren't expecting, a grave. It is marked by a simple wooden board, or rather, by what was once a wooden board, and is now a fragment of heavily weathered wood about 18 inches long, driven into the ground at a slight angle. There is no text visible on it. If there was ever a name carved or painted on this marker, it is gone. The soil around the base of the marker is slightly mounded in a way that is consistent with a burial. Though a century of forest growth and soil movement has softened and obscured the mound almost completely, there are no other markers nearby. This is a single grave, isolated, away from the main body of the town site. We don't know who is buried here. We may never know. The records for small mining communities of this period are fragmentary at best. The local newspapers that covered these districts were often short-lived, folding when the boom ended, and the copies that survive are scattered across various archives in incomplete runs. The county death records from this era are similarly incomplete, particularly for remote locations where the nearest county seat might be a full day's travel away, and where a death in the middle of winter might not be officially recorded until months later, if ever. What we do know is that people died in these mining towns regularly, and for a variety of reasons. Mining accidents were common: falling rock, premature blasts, shaft falls, crushing injuries from equipment. Disease moved through these isolated, densely housed communities with terrible efficiency. Tuberculosis was endemic in the mining camps of this period, spread by the rock dust that filled every tunnel and the close quarters of the bunkhouses above. Typhoid from contaminated water sources, pneumonia from working wet and cold in underground workings day after day. The seasonal influenzas that killed people every winter before there were vaccines or antibiotics. And there were simply the ordinary deaths that occur in any community: old age, heart failure, the accumulated wear of a hard life in a hard place. What is striking about this grave, isolated as it is from the main body of the town, is its location. In most mining communities of this era, the dead were buried in a designated plot, sometimes a formal cemetery, sometimes just an agreed-upon corner of the town site set aside for the purpose. A single isolated grave away from the main concentration of burials usually suggests one of two things. Either this person died at a time when the community was too dispersed or too hasty in its final departure to organize a proper burial, or there was some social reason, a reason we can no longer know, why this individual was buried separately. We will probably never know which it was. The mountain keeps that secret too. Whoever this person was, they came to this mountain with some version of the same hope that brought everyone here. The hope of striking it rich, or of making enough to build a better life somewhere else, or perhaps just the more modest hope of steady work and a wage, and enough to get by. They ended up here permanently in this forest while everyone else moved on. The mountain kept them when it let everyone else go. We stand at the grave for a while. It feels right to do that, to acknowledge the presence, even without a name to attach it to let the silence of this place be the silence it is, not just the atmospheric backdrop to an exploration video, but the actual meaningful quiet of a place where someone's story ended, and where the forest has been standing watch ever since. Coming back through the main part of the town site on our way out, the afternoon light has shifted and come down lower. And in that lower light, the ruins take on a different quality. The shadows are longer. The moss seems to glow more intensely. The hollow rectangles of the cabin footprints look more clearly like what they are, the outlines of rooms where people slept and ate and spent the ordinary hours of their lives. The ironwork in the soil catches the light at new angles. The whole place feels, in this light, less like a ruin and more like a presence. That is the thing about these places that keeps drawing us back to them year after year, site after site. They are not just historical curiosities. They are not just good content, though they are that too. They are places where the distance between the past and the present is unusually thin, where a century seems like less than it is, where the objects and the structures and the altered landscape carry enough of the original reality within them that you can feel, if you let yourself, the actual weight of what happened here. The actual human cost of the boom and the bust that was the story of every one of these mountain towns. The actual lives that were lived and lost and moved on from in this narrow window of time between the first strike and the last miner walking out of the drainage with his tools on his back and not looking back. This town got 10 years. The forest has had it for over a week. The forest, it has to be said, has done beautiful work. We'll be back in the snow fields in the spring to look more carefully at the lower end of the mill site, where we believe there may be additional foundation work buried under the bank on the creek side. There is also what appears to be a secondary trail leading up toward the upper mine workings above the town, and we want to follow that when conditions allow. These sites give up their secrets slowly, and we are in no hurry. The mountain has been patient. We can be patient too. Thank you for being here with us today. If you have any information about this district, any family connection to the people who lived and worked here, or any historical documentation that might help us better understand what this place was, please reach out in the comments. Every piece of information helps. We'll see you on the next one.